Our commentator today is Thomas Dodman. He's assistant professor in the Department of French and the college at Columbia University. He's the author of What Nostalgia Was, War, Empire and the Time of a Deadly Emotion, which has come out just this year, just last couple of months, yeah? At Chicago, in Chicago. He's currently co-editing a global history of war for the Éditions du Seuil and researching a micro-history of a French Revolutionary era soldier based on his correspondence. A cultural and intellectual historian of modern France, Dr. Dodman received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2011 and was a Mellon Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He previously taught at Boston College and currently serves as associate editor for Emotion Review. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marisa. Thank you all for inviting me to this panel. When I was first contacted about this panel, I of course responded enthusiastically, yes, I'd love to do it. About a week ago, when I received all the papers, panic started settling in and lasted until very late last night, if not about 30 seconds ago. Now I am nonetheless going to try to make you not feel frustrated with what I have to say. So, these three fascinating papers in this panel share a number of features and claims that signal a shift to phase 2 or perhaps phase 3 of what the history of emotions can do as a form of historical inquiry and perhaps also epistemology. It is almost 20 years since Bill Ready's seminal The Navigation of Feeling appeared on the bookshelves, coincidentally the day before the Twin Towers came down, proposing a radical roadmap for the subfield, drawing with equal ease from anthropology and cognitive psychology, and offering a provocative rereading of the revolutionary saga through this lens. Today, while there is clearly a gold rush fever in the air about the history of emotions, and I'm quoting that from Jan Plamper's recent synthesis, which I encourage you all to read, it's a fascinating book, there remains deep mistrust, I think, about this objet séduisant et difficile, as Lucien Febvre famously put it back in the 1930s, within a profession averse to the unclear and sometimes mushy contours of our inner life. Yet, each in their own way, these three papers show the importance of paying attention to the emotional, and specifically to what Monique Scher has fruitfully called emotional practices, drawing from a Bourdieusian analysis. Not necessarily because we should all be doing the history of emotions, heaven forbid. I have the word in my book title, and yet I still have nightmares about it just about every night. But because we cannot go on doing histories that willfully leave emotions out. Otherwise, we are no better than business school economists with a fraction of the paycheck. Here, the question is really, what are revolutionary emotions? What is revolutionary about them, and how do they mediate revolutionary transformation? So what I want to suggest these papers highlight in three ways, or perhaps moments, and one of the questions is really how do these moments interlock, is three ways in which we should be thinking about revolutionary emotions. One, as purposeful cognitive motors of revolutionary action, so willful. Two, as more unpredictable and unruly ones. Three, as mediators of revolutionary inaction. Ian Collis starts his investigation of revolutionary enthusiasm with a deputation of young Parisian sectionnaires at the National Convention, declaring that they had abolished all ostensible signs of religion from their classrooms. And if this sounds familiar, I think it is meant to sound familiar. A situation that is, of course, uncannily familiar to us today, but which Collis portrays in a rather unfamiliar way, as an instance of open-ended patriotism, a form of revolutionary enthusiasm that transcends the local and the national to reach out to the global. Collar emphasizes the specificity of this enthusiasm as a purposeful revolutionary emotional practice, not an irrational outburst, itself shaped by revolutionary events. He historicizes enthusiasm and notes its change in meaning in the late 18th century in gradual juxtaposition to fanaticism, a suspect concept suffused with Orientalist and Islamophobic trimmings at the time, as it is still very much today. The semantic change yielded a positive reevaluation of enthusiasm as the emotional frame, this is his expression, for a new form of sincerity and revolutionary practice, that of a patriotic gift and spirit of self-sacrifice. But all this was not just about narrow patriotism. The enthusiasm opened up, and I quote, a political space for participation beyond the nation, an open-ended global term that Koller illustrates with the case of foreigners wanting to participate in the Festival of the Federation. Of course, there is the Prussian Jean-Baptiste Clootz, but there are many others as well, including individuals conspicuous for their Muslim dress. In this instance, the presence of the turbans no longer functioned as a marker of abject fanaticism, but rather of universalism and inclusion. It produced, and I quote, a wave of emotion deeply connected both to the universalism of the revolution and to its struggles over religion, and thus opened up a new space of possibility, a new horizon of expectation, perhaps, for the revolution. Rather than speak of a transfer of sacrality to the nation with Mona Ozouf, Ian Koller therefore invites us to think of this form of revolutionary enthusiasm as opening up a process of transformation, or translation as he puts it, where self-sacrifice marks active connection to the world collective and sort of creates this collective through this practice. In the Panic of May 1792, Tim Tackett yanks us back from global connections to the micro-historical, taking out his magnifying glass to explore the case study of some lesser-known journée in May 1792, in which wild rumors of royalist conspiracies and a series of unrelated events led Parisians into a frenzy and spurred revolutionary legislators into taking a series of radical measures. This was a panic both comparable to other great moments of popular unrest, and of course the Great Fear of 1789 and Georges Lefebvre's classic treatment of it looms in the background here, but also different in that it cut across social groups, gripping social and political elites as well as le peuple, and spurring a whole host of revolutionary institutions, from the legislature to the sections to the National Guards, into taking common action. Tackett deftly explores what I would call the concatenation of long-term and short-term causes, the circumstances and aleatory happenings, both intentional and non, that cumulatively produced an event. And I think the model here, at least for me in this respect, would be Bill Sewell's classic article on the Bastille and the transformation of structures, in which he shows that, à la Marshall Salins, of course, how happenings only become events when rubbing up against the structures in the wrong way, so to say. And I should point out that this article is from 1996, if I remember correctly, and Bill was already then saying we need to pay attention to emotions in how we construct this event. Tackett reviews the tense political context and swirling rumors that reigned in 1792, the impact of the war, and especially of the political responses to the catastrophic defeats of that spring. And then he brings into the mix the rather odd response elicited by speeches given by Brissot and Jean Sonnet on May 23rd. Odd because greeted with a strangely subdued response and seemingly unanimous approval of a measure, and a measure of a front commun against this grand royalist conspiracy. And I think I found this really fascinating, the response to these speeches. I think that's something really worth exploring more, perhaps even borrowing from ideas such as the transmission of affect and sort of really trying to flesh out what is actually going on in that room, because it seems so counterintuitive. And of course, this is a grand royalist conspiracy that was then supposedly revealed by the completely random explosion of a powder depot, setting alight that poudrière, c'est le cas de le dire, that Paris had become in those days, and bringing National Guards out onto the streets and turning sections towards permanent emergency sessions. For Tackett, this rather unruly, hyper-emotional panic was a bit of a storm in a teacup, except that it had real consequent and significant consequences on the course of events in the following months. It revived the delegitimization of the king and drift towards republicanism that I was interested in learning could have been reversed at this point, just before post-Varenne. I thought post-Varenne it was sort of done, but maybe not. It spurred the section's turn to a permanent war footing, and it provoked the temporary unifying of political forces in the Assembly to pass radical legislation against the king, refractory priests, and the summoning of the future fédérés to Paris. These measures were then in turn resisted by Louis XVI, thus reinforcing fears and confirming these fears about his treachery, setting up a sort of domino effect of cumulative radicalization that eventually led to the momentous events of that summer, and then September, of course. Revolutionary times are not normal times, Tackett rightly reminds us. Well, except that they also sometimes are all too normal, as Rebecca Spang's sobering analysis of revolutionary frustration reminds us. Far from the enthusiasm of proclamations and panic of conspiracy theory, Spang describes in excruciating detail the slow torture and frustration of actually having to make a revolution happen, of having to make a new regime stick. It's the dialectic of the sort of permanent versus frozen revolution at play here. In her sources, we see the tedium of the administrative revolution as it becomes a new normal. The chaos brought by bureaucratic reforms and personnel changes, the indecision and anxiety that all of this necessarily entails, and the many unintended consequences that it produces. Most of all, we hear the complaints of overwork, tiredness, stress, and discomfort, physical discomfort, of having to deal with these mountains of paperwork that the revolution seems to have produced. In the light of a copious archival evidence, Spang invites us to view the year 2 as more as being about the impossibility of putting theory into practice than about the terror, more about revolutionaries' frustration and what Ben Kafka has called the psychic life of paperwork, or how bureaucracy fails itself and therefore us constantly and necessarily, than it is about heads falling off, being chopped off. And here I cannot resist thinking of myself and the sort of glorified image of what we do as academics and the reality of what we actually spend most of our time doing. And for those of you who haven't yet filed your taxes, you can think about that too, when you, especially when you've moved to a new state and you have to do it all over again and learn about how this state does its damn taxes. But like Koller, Spang turns to historical semantics and conceptual history to see whether we can therefore speak of frustration, perhaps the great frustration of 1793. No, we cannot. Frustration in this sense only appears late in the 19th century, as we just heard. Neither can we speak of vexation, embêtement. I did wonder whether ennui was not a word. I mean, it's definitely a word that is in use at this time, and there is the famous debate between Diderot and Helvétius on sort of ennui as being something of the rich or something of the working poor. I think that might be, I mean, the expressions would be, it is used in the sort of tedium sense, in the sort of longueur sort of having to do something that's boring. So I wonder if that would not be a word that might help sort of address this problem, this sort of vexing conundrum of the history of emotions, as you pointed out so nicely, between the sort of biological universal on the one hand, the bodily, and the linguistic, the historically specific on the other, and the lag that we often end up finding between these two. In my own work, I sort of came to the conclusion that Romanticism could not be nostalgic because the word did not exist at the time. It's only much, in that sense, in that romantic sense, it's only much later that it does. But and so we end up with the case of Saint-André, which I must admit I was puzzled by, I wasn't convinced by, until you finally made it all click right at the end, and I understood what you were trying to say, that in these moments of frustration, of vexation, of ennui, it's in those moments there that the horizons of possibility of revolutionary agency actually open up, because we have choices to make. And that we have to make, otherwise our head gets chopped off. And it reminds me of sort of that feeling that you have when you have to write that article, and you know you're going to get it done somehow. You just don't know how, but you will get it done, right? So what do these histories of revolutionary motions do for us? A couple of quick things. They draw our attention to the micro, to the intimate. Predictably so, that's what emotions tends to point us to, but they also point us to the macro and to global ties, and I think that's a really important sort of new direction that the history of emotions is currently taking. What is how do emotions translate across cultures and different places. They focus our gaze on the contingencies of the moment while forcing us to think the many channels of causality, intentional and non, that travel through time, and perhaps even those pre-semantic and bodily ones, and here I'm thinking of affect, that generally have us historians cringing. One big payoff of all of this, and these three papers, it seems to me, and I'll say it, is to provincialize the terror, or at least to displace it, both historically and historiographically. And here I do want to nod to some of the sort of pioneers of the history of emotions that work on this period and who've offered alternative explanations for the terror. Sophie Wanish, of course, Jacobin rage is leading to the terror, and then here you think of Danton, soyons terribles pour dispenser le peuple de l'être, of course, so there's a very, very interesting explanation there. Patrice Higonet's work on Jacobin disillusionment and despair and trauma as leading to the terror. Bill Reddy's work, of course, already cited on how an emotional refuge can become a form of sort of political nightmare with the terror. And Tim Tackett's own work, previous work on a first terror and the sort of many contingent processes that sort of led, again, in a sort of functionalist kind of argument towards down the road of terror, not with a sort of clear intentionality from the beginning. These papers, I think, point us to an histoire sensible of the revolution that need not feel compelled to necessarily explain, justify, or recuse the terror, but that can precisely rescue the larger revolutionary sequence from the political violence of the year too, not because it wasn't important, of course it was, but because the revolution was so much more than that. And here I'm thinking of the comparisons for me would be works such as Debbie Gould's book on ACT UP and sort of moving politics, if I remember correctly. And very recently, Ludivine Bantigny's new book just out on May 68, Des Grands Soirs au Petit Matin, which really tries to rescue the radical opening up of horizons, of expectations, of possibilities of an event that has become ossified by some fairly sort of stereotypical images, slogans in the case of 68, or the idea that it was just a great big party and that everybody was having fun and nobody really knew what they were doing. This is here, therefore, a sort of history of emotions as a critical history of the present, something that we all need all the more in our age of rage and politicized emotions. Couple of very quick questions. One, for Ian, I have to push you on the sort of, clearly you chose to start the piece with the sort of image of the school and the sort of another possibility for another laïcité, perhaps in this universal, that embraces universalism, right? But that from our standpoint, of course, we have to sort of ask the question, then what went wrong, or sort of where does it flip into the kind of totalizing laïcité that we sort of associate to the universalism of the French schools today. And so I'm wondering if you just have thoughts about that. Tim, similarly about the what I would call the Union Sacrée of May 92nd. I was fascinated by the sort of how the Girondins, Jacobins, Feuillants all sort of came together in silence, which is just this sort of underwhelming kind of response. What does it open up another possibility will it open up a possibility for a different kind of revolutionary radicalization? I mean, are you suggesting that, or is that just my reading of it? And Rebecca, I was going to ask you more about Jean-Paul Saint-André's sort of sense of empowerment, but now it finally sort of clicked for me, so I don't have to ask you that question anymore. Instead, I'll ask you perhaps one last question for all of you. Is Zèle a revolutionary emotion? Zeal? I mean, it's the word that always strikes me in the documents, and you see it so much through and through, and it's not a word that I sort of associate to any other period quite so much. So I'm wondering if we can think of Zèle as a revolutionary process. Okay, and with zeal, I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We have a few minutes for questions. I think we can overrun slightly because lunch isn't till 12:30. I'd like to invite the panelists first of all if they'd like to give brief comments, responses to the comments, only because we don't have a lot of time. So if you want to do that, or we can go straight on to questions. You want to go straight on to the question? Okay, right. Questions? Yes.
I'm totally convinced the administrative correspondence holds significance for understanding something important about the revolution. But I feel, so to speak, that you really offered two different interpretations. One is to provide a foundation for interpreting the correspondence in relation to the history of the emotions, and the follow-up would presumably be to attend to the language used more closely and get around language we instinctively use that's more post-revolutionary. But I also feel like there's a certain methodological clearing of the ground going on in your talk, and one could draw the conclusion that we really shouldn't study this in terms of the history of the emotions at all. And I would propose that what we want to realize is interchange is going on here. Questions are being asked and answered, and probably in a very different manner than under the absolute monarchy. So that there's an opportunity for comparison. You know, how does a superior manage an inferior within a democratic culture without appearing too superior? Are questions being asked that one wouldn't dare ask in the previous regime? I think, to me, that seems like the most significant opportunity, not understanding their underlying emotions.
That's a super interesting question, and it's worth observing, as some of you may know, but many of you probably don't. In late 91, 92, 93, as the national political body is getting more and more panicked about the failure of tax receipts, they start publishing, or printing rather, what can only be called league tables that list, these are the départements that have managed to get their rolls 30% done, 50% done, 100% done, and they send out copies of these every month, first to show, how they're doing in terms of listing who owes, each department is doing in terms of putting together the rolls, and then how they're doing in terms of actually recovering the sums identified. Over and over again, at the top of the league rankings comes the Département of the Doubs. And I had assumed, having seen that over and over again, they're just fiddling the numbers. There's no way they could always be first. So then I went to Besançon and looked at what they were doing. And what's remarkable is that there's almost no turnover of personnel until 1794. So they're communicating with people they know. I didn't look to see if they're communicating in the same way. But it seems that the actual absence of a revolution in personnel makes it easier to actually carry out the goals of the administrative and political revolution. And it would be very interesting, I think, to do a comparison across time and also of several different départements that have different profiles in that way.
Could I add just one additional comment on the problem between Jambon, Saint-André, and the department, and that there's a whole level of political jousting between the department and Jambon is both a member of the district and of the municipality and districts. This is especially Montauban, which is way south of Cahors, which is the department, and there's a long-term battle going on between Jambon and the department.
Yes, there's absolutely no doubt that throughout this period, the districts and the département in many places are really at loggerheads.
And there's an emotion, not just of frustration, but I think of anger.
Yeah.
Towards the people in Cahors.
Yeah.
Can I add that Jambon Saint-André ends up in Algiers?
There you go.
Just saying.
The conclusion of that is what?
But he's the perfect figure for this panel.
With or without a term.
Yes, if you just wait, they'll read the mic, yeah. And then if you just give your name, thanks.
I'm Caitlin Carter. I'm from the University of Michigan. I really enjoyed this panel. I guess my question is mostly for Timothy Tackett. I'm wondering, you mentioned the relationship between reason and emotions, often pitted as sort of opposites, but it strikes me that in the case that you're talking about, and maybe this is specific to the emotion of panic, though I'm still thinking that through, that actually what these people are doing are very rational responses to the information that they have, even though a lot of it is untrue, or later we know is untrue, but given what they know, that what they're doing is actually a rational response. response. So I'm just wondering if you could comment further maybe on the relationship between emotions and rationality or
Well, I think
reason.
they're integrally interrelated throughout the revolution, and I think that's one of the conclusions that theoreticians in neurology and social sciences conclude that there's always a tight interaction, and it's often impossible to disentangle them. It's clear that these folks in May 1792 were frightened and were extremely worried about what was going on, and were imagining all kinds of things that inflated their fears. But you're absolutely right. And we know from other studies of panic that panic doesn't necessarily lead to fight or flight, I guess is the term that's sometimes been used, but it can also be something very creative. And people rationally trying to deal with what they're feeling and coming to sometimes in this case and in another two other panics that one could talk about, 1789 July and March, April 1793. It's really very similar. Tremendous fear, tremendous anxiety over what's going to happen, imagining how this could be much worse, but then sitting down and trying to figure out what they can do to face these fears. So, I don't see that that's a problem. Distinguishing emotion and reason, I think they always work very closely together, it seems to me.
Would you put September
Mike, Jeremy.
Jeremy Popkin, would you put the September Massacres in the same category?
I think that's certainly a case of panic, and it's a panic that, again, goes across society. We generally think of the September Massacres as being a panic among the populace, but if we look at the personal correspondence of the time, if we look at the newspapers, it's clear that the elites, the political elites, are just as much panicked at the time and are quite applauding what the massacres, applauding them, or at the least saying, well, it's too bad, but we got to kill the devil before he kills you. But this is different. But I think it's interesting that there are some other panics, and that would be a case in point in which there is not a creative, rational action that comes out of it. I mean, you could talk about the Declaration of the Republic, I suppose, but I'm not sure that there's a very tight connection between that. So I think that's, a case in which panic does not lead to creative action.
Is it on? Yeah, green. Okay. Ronan Steinberg, Michigan State University. Just as a comment, we today, due to brain imaging and whatever, and then the neurosciences come to all kinds of conclusions about how cognition and affect are intertwined or related. I'm not sure exactly how to, how to theorize this, but at the time, though, I mean, in the 18th century. Since Rebecca referred to the encyclopedia, for example, related panic to terror and said that both are forms of fear that are distinct in that they're not based in reality. They're completely rooted in the imagination. Panic, etymologically comes from Pan, the god Pan, right? And there's a story there that they take from somewhere. It doesn't matter, but he created fear among the armies that decimated each other or something like that. And so at that time, it seemed they did make some kind of a distinction, right, in the 18th century that we might that not be significant for how they understand what they're doing or what they're reacting to or what they're... Do you see my question? Yeah. Thank you.
Think about the distinction that they made between... You were bringing up terror. Are you trying to get terror into this mix?
Well, I mean, the actual entry, one of the entries on terror in the encyclopédie, I think it's one of those written by the Chevalier de Jaucourt, who seemed to have written a great deal there. But anyway, he said I think the entry was terror, and he said terror and panic in the titles of the entry, and he said both are distinct in that they're rooted in the imagination, which, in the map of the Enlightenment was kind of a dangerous faculty, right? So they're not based on reality. They're derived from the imagination. That's what makes them dangerous, and I think the word they used also is contagious, because they're actually not based on a correct reading of reality. For them at the time, then, they seem to be making distinctions between how you read reality rationally and how you panic, in an AMA kind of. So might that not be significant for how they understand what they're doing, regardless of what we now know about cognition and effect, is my question. Who do I give this to?
Can I say one thing, which is just that I think, just like we don't agree on these questions, neither did Enlightenment thinkers, or even in the encyclopedia, lots of different writers. So this question about enthusiasm, and I mean, there's a kind of valorization of a certain kind of enthusiasm. And I think Jocourt arguing on behalf of enthusiasm that it's absolutely necessary, and without enthusiasm, artworks have no life, have nothing, they couldn't possibly be of any significance whatsoever. But, does that then mean that this comes through the emotion, or is this a form of imagination where impressions strike directly on the reason? These are just, they're very complex arguments that are going on in the same kinds of ways that we are discussing these questions now. So I think this is, there's a problem if we try to create a kind of frozen picture of what Enlightenment thought about these questions was. I think they were just, and I think this is where both of the other papers here are really very much situated in these changing and debated and complex questions about how to interpret and how to understand and how to respond to emotional situations.
I think if you to focus only on the word terror, there's an enormous range of definitions and meanings of terror in the course of the French Revolution. Terror as extreme fright, but also terror as a political policy, and a lot of things in between. So you would have to come to some kind of agreement as to what you mean there in trying to assess this text. It's an interesting text, though. I'll have to go back to it sometime.
Was there someone? Yes.
Catherine Schulteis from George Washington University. I just wanted to ask anyone on the panel, this is very foreign to me, except that I look at psychology in the late 19th century, but I'm wondering what these studies of emotions do to the concept of the historical subject in general and the idea of agency. Are we by studying emotions in this way and their role in the revolution, are we asking for a new interpretation of historical agency and subjectivity, and are we implying that that the emotions of an individual are somehow causal, or are we looking at an emotion as some kind of disembodied phenomenon that plays a historical role?
Right. Who wants to answer that in 2 minutes?
Well, I think the point about agency is really, crucial in the sense that it does, thinking about these emotional frames and not simply about those who could exercise high-level literacy and leave very, leave kind of discursive traces, that this does offer, for example, in the case of these 11-year-old schoolboys, right, that we can, in some sense, reconstitute some level of their agency as actors within the revolution, but through that kind of emotional participation. I think it's not about constituting emotion as causative. It's really more thinking about the emotional frames, I think, that are kind of shared between groups of people and that allow, certainly, and I think so importantly in the revolutionary situation, that in some ways they define the revolutionary situation. And I think that sense of what we would imagine as being frustration, in fact being zeal, right? That there are, it's reconstituting and taking us back into the emotional frames within which these actions, and I think actions is the really crucial thing here, not so much feelings.
Yeah, I would just point out, I don't know if that's answering your question, but there is a huge debate on the relationship between emotions and actions. I mean, in our social scientists, how do you get from people who are angry, Parisians who are angry, who are even hate these nobles who have shot and killed many of their friends in the courtyard of the Tuileries Palace on the 10th of August. How do you get from that to actually murdering 11 to 1,400 people, as in the case of the September Massacres? How do you get from an emotion to an action? Are there typical actions or consistent actions that come out of specific emotions? There's a big debate on that, as I understand it, and I'm not sure if I can contribute to it. But it's not a simple question, obviously.
And I think maybe the one thing I'd want to add is that in the revival of interest about agency, which seems important in the aftermath both of a structuralist turn and then a discursive turn, and then say, well, no, actually there are some people here. Agency does too often then sort of slide over into a temptation to make simple causal claims. And that's the mistake. It's the importance of seeing lots of actors who may or may not feel that they can take certain actions, being in connection with each other and figuring out what those networks are and the sorts of sort of feedback mechanisms that happen between all these different kinds of actors.
Perhaps one very brief question. There's a brief. Okay, 'cause it's almost time for lunch. In that case, I am sure that there will be many questions you can give to our speakers later. Thank you.